Bloody Truth with the very, very lovely Aime Rushton. Hello, Amy. How are you?
Hello, Samantha. I'm fabulous. How are you?
Yes, I'm good, thank you. As always, I have this little panic that happens whenever I go live that I'm not live in the right place. So hopefully the internet's doing its thing and it will catch up. I'm going to have to just trust the technology at some point. I'll keep an eye on it. While I'm doing that, because I'm sure we are live in the right place, I will hand over to you to introduce yourself. I always find people have their own words, how they like to say it, and I'm sure that I'll like mess that up. So please introduce yourself.
And you'd probably be far too kind about it anyway. So I'm Amy, and I have worked in the field of human resources for about 20 odd years now, which feels far too long. I've worked as a HR generalist in a few different sectors, so I've got lots of experience from lots of different types of organisations in that sense. But for the last year, I've been working more as a consultant, and I have my own business called Magpie People, where I work as a consultant in the sort of cultural, team dynamics, management, development space, which is really cool, which means I get to work with people more on the fun, meaty stuff where we hopefully make work a little bit better for people.
Amazing. I love Magpie People. I think that's just... And you have new amazing branding now as well.
I do. From lovely Kaylee. She's awesome. Yeah, and I just love funky, colourful stuff, which you wouldn't tell from where I am today. This is not intentional. I feel like I need to say while we're live. I have a client meeting with a lovely client later, and they've very generously given me a space, and it's like a performance space, so there's a curtain behind me. So maybe we'll just do this through the medium of interpretive dance. It could go that way. I promise that it won't.
I don't think I should do that. But I'm loving our sort of pink and the blackness.
It's very contrasting, isn't it? It's very Wednesday and Enid coded. I've got like moody lighting as well, which is really bizarre. But I just need people to know this was not my own setup. I thought I'm going to go dark and mysterious for my chat with Samantha.
Well, I mean, we are talking about taboos.
Exactly.
When we were talking about this conversation, the title we said was culture and cramps. No one should have to fake a cold, because I think people do. I've seen it a lot in my own research. I've got a research survey that I do, and people, apart from like a handful, I think, where you're in organisations, either you feel that the culture is safe to say that, or you feel particularly brave to be able to say that, not knowing the culture. But for the most part, I think people do like say, like, I've got a cold, I've got a migraine, I don't feel very well, I've got something to do mysteriously for the next 3 to 5 days. No,
yeah, exactly.
Probably not that. At least the first day of like, yeah,
a gig for MI6 or something. Can't talk about it and can't discuss. Yeah,
yeah. But it seems to happen that way, and it just makes me sad. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I do what I do, so that we can like change those conversations. I thought it was really interesting to have this conversation with you, because I know that you work with culture and teams. So how much of someone's experience of work, like especially if they're struggling with their symptoms, comes down to the relationship they have with their manager?
I think it's a really interesting question. And in my experience, a lot of their experience will come down to their management capability of their line manager and just the relationship that they have with them. But I think that's true of any workspace. That, I mean, we all know people, and I know myself, I've left organisations because I haven't gelled with the manager, or they've not created a particularly good environment. And I think we're much more tuned into that these days. But I think when it comes to a subject like this, where it's already for a lot of people a little bit of a taboo to talk about, or it's difficult to talk about, or it feels really personal to talk about, you're already on the back foot then, aren't you, in terms of building that relationship and being open and honest about it. So if you've got a manager who isn't really capable of building that trusting, open environment for stuff that it is okay to talk about, how on earth are you going to be able to do it about stuff that feels more difficult to broach? So I think it does come down to it. And I know that in my experience as a HR professional, assisting managers and helping individuals and making sure that everybody's getting the most out of the working environment, it can be a real sticking point, and it can be something that creates a huge amount of difficulty, because if people are having difficulties with their menstrual cycle and that's causing health concerns, or that just means that, you know, for a couple of days a month they might have bad cramps but the rest of the time they might be absolutely fine, you do begin to see patterns with people where they will sort of, you know, perhaps call in with a cold or flu or some other sort of socially acceptable thing. And, you know, I remember dealing with somebody where a manager had said, "Oh, I've noticed this sick pattern." And it was because I had provided them with sick information that they weren't getting before, and said, "Oh, you know, this is how you look for patterns, this is how you do this." And they got really excited about being able to do this and said, "Oh, look, I've noticed this pattern with this person." Every few weeks they phone in sick with a cold or with a back or whatever, and it's, you know, it's always at this point in the month or whatever. And you know, when you're kind of going, do you seriously not think what I'm thinking here, that this is a monthly occurrence, you know? And they just weren't getting it at all, and we spoke to the individual and they were like, "Oh, I hadn't really noticed a pattern, no." And, you know, I could tell they were fibbing, and I had a private conversation with them and just said, like, is there anything else going on? And they just said, "Yeah, I get really, really bad period cramps. I just don't feel I can talk to a manager about it." And you just think, God, that's really, really sad. And that is something that you shouldn't be penalised for. Not that you should be for, you know, saying you've got a bad back or a cold or whatever, but it's, you tend to get people who are your frequent flyers that call in with a cold whenever they're having a bad day. Sometimes that's a conversation to have around, you know, resilience and coming into work. Somebody who legitimately has really bad cramps for a couple of days a month, there might be an adjustment you're able to make. They might be able to carry on working, just do some different things that day or whatever. But that's down to the manager to create that environment and that relationship, as much as it is on the individual to take responsibility for it and to, you know, be able to be honest about those things. But it's I think it's such a huge part of it. And I think, you know, I know I've seen, and I'm sure there are countless other HR people that would listen to this and go, God, yeah, I could list, you know, 10, 20 people who have suffered because they haven't been able to be honest.
Yeah, it's so true. And I think sometimes, I mean, traditionally managers, not always, but some of the time have just ended up as managers because they've been in the organisation a long time, and that's just been their progression, rather than, I think nowadays it's like, well, what is the progression? Is it like a sidestep within your department, just a different role, perhaps staying where you are, maybe just with different responsibilities? But it doesn't necessarily, like, the length that you have been in an organisation doesn't naturally dictate that you will become like a manager one day, because there's certain skills that need to be had, I think, to like have those conversations, you know, the difficult ones at least.
It's
I
not
don't know.
well.
Do you think? Oh, you carry on.
No, I was going to say, I don't know where I go with this, but I was going to say, I think it's really important that people understand that being a good manager is not something you're necessarily born with. Yes, there are going to be people that step into that role and it's like they've always been in it and just their natural capabilities take over and they're a brilliant leader. That's fine. I'm not saying that there aren't people like that. But I think even with those people, you should be willing to listen to other people's experience in an area. You should be willing to hone the skills that, even if you have already have them, you should be willing to go, well, why do I need these skills? Could I be honing them even more? I think it's such an important part of management to be curious and to be adaptable and to be thinking about, okay, my role as a manager in leading this team is to be making my expectations of the people in their roles and their behaviours in the team as well really, really clear. These are our absolute do's, these are our absolute don'ts, and then everything in between is kind of just down to the individual. And that's something that managers need to have confidence to do, and they need to be able to step into that space and know that they're going to get it wrong sometimes. The people on the team are going to get things wrong. It's how you then adapt and deal with that in a confident way. And I think when it comes down to talking about things like people having issues with their periods, or just people having periods full stop, because let's face it, it doesn't have to be something that's excruciatingly painful every month or even something that bothers you, but it is something that happens. And when you are having a period, you're going to need access to toilets, you're going to potentially need access to period products if you haven't brought stuff with you, or, you know, if you're a female that works on a, you know, someone that menstruates, you work on a building site. That might actually mean that you need an adaptation for a few days a month or whatever it might be. And it's about knowing that it's just part of life, and that manager that makes an open space where you're able to have those conversations, and it's just natural. And I think it's also about the manager understanding how private the individual as well. There are going to be some people who are more than happy to say in a massive team meeting, regardless of whether it's men, women, or whoever, they're going to be like, yeah, do you know what? This is what I need. I really struggle with this. And that's absolutely great. It's still okay to be a really private person about this stuff. And I think that's really important. That I feel like people have this really binary, it is or it isn't, when it comes to trying to educate people and make it more normal to talk about things like periods in the workplace. They feel like they either have to be sort of like, you know, twirling tampons around in the office, or they have to be like, or they have to be saying nothing at all. And it's like
smuggling.
Yeah, like, oh yeah, the up the sleeve thing and stuff that we've all done. But I think it's like there's a lot of middle ground there, and it's absolutely fine to be an individual about it. And it's down to your individuality that dictates your relationship with your manager, as it does with every other part of your job as well. So I think it's important to note that you can still be yourself in all of this. You don't have to suddenly be talking to absolutely everybody you meet on the street about it. It is just about, as an individual, taking responsibility for your own health. And I think that's something that I know from my experience as a teenager. Bearing in mind I was a teenager in the 90s, sort of early 2000s, so just a couple of years ago now.
Yeah. And I think a particularly toxic time, really, as well.
So toxic. And I think sometimes people look back on it with rose-tinted glasses, and they're sort of like, it was the Spice Girls, like girl power era. It's like, actually, women were horrifically objectified in the 90s.
Heroin chic.
Heroin chic, yeah. If you didn't look like Kate Moss, then don't leave the house. And nothing Kate Moss, absolutely beautiful, but it was just that unrealistic standard, wasn't it? And I think the language that we started to use more openly and in public, sort of in the press and in the media in those days, it became a lot more familiar, didn't it? It wasn't the BBC English and we don't talk about certain things. It was really like that lad culture, lads and ladettes, and, you know, big breakfast and all that stuff, which was great. But it also meant that all of those things that were said about women behind closed doors became really prevalent. And it was like people, you know, God, you had people like Britney Spears being called fat in magazines just because she was quite muscular at times, you know, and you're just like, my God, I would kill to look like her. And you just think,
also writing lyrics like "Hit me, baby, one more time." I mean,
exactly. But well, she didn't.
They heard her lyrics.
She didn't write it. She's the person. I mean, we could have a whole other conversation about Britney Spears, but maybe for another day. But I think it is about that culture where everything you had to be perfect, and so having a period wasn't something you could talk about, and if you did, it was gross. So you were being a bit controversial, and you were deliberately provoking people if you did it, or you had to be really private, and it was something that couldn't affect you. Because I think as a woman, if you wanted to achieve anything, you couldn't show any weakness at all, because you had to be over and above what any man was doing. And I think that then plays into, you can't show any weakness just because you're having your period, because I mean, okay, I know we can say now it's not a female-only thing, but biologically, that's something that only half of the population experience. So then you're immediately setting yourself from the other half of the population who don't experience it. And that's something that I think that we've had to hide. And it's really difficult to untrain yourself. And it's really difficult then in the workplace where I have always said, and most people I know that I work with want to be, to younger people in the workplace, the person that they never had. You know, I think we grew up with a lot of people who, through no fault of their own, lived in that cycle of martyrdom where it was like, I dealt with this and it was a struggle, so therefore it has to be a struggle for you as well, you know, just to kind of put up and shut up. And we want to be a little bit more like, this was really tough for me, so how can I give you my experience and my knowledge and make it better for you? And I think there's that side of it, but there's also really getting stuck in there with managers and going, you can't shy away from these conversations, because there's going to be a good number of people in all likelihood in your team who are affected by some part of their cycle, or at least are experiencing a cycle. Because like we said, it doesn't need to be that you're adversely affected by it. Just the fact that you have a cycle means that you have certain needs every month. And why isn't it the norm to have those conversations? Because if you have those conversations with people and you understand their needs and you're able to be flexible and adaptable as much as you can within the boundaries of the role. I'm not saying you need to just, a job is a job and it needs to be done. And I think that's part of the conversation as well with managers, is having the confidence to know when they can't flex things as well. And that's absolutely okay. And knowing that it's not about giving people everything they want. It's not about opening the floodgates to people taking the mick. It is about individual conversations and knowing when things work and when things don't work.
100%.
Yeah, have those conversations and get the most out of people. And if you're able to do that, I mean, I remember working with somebody where we'd had somebody who was fairly young. They were fairly new in their career. I think they'd been diagnosed with something like PCOS, if I remember rightly, really struggling with like a heavy flow and just different symptoms throughout the month. And they wanted a little bit of flexibility to work at home a couple of days when it was really bad. The manager was like, oh, can you have a chat with them and tell them it's a no? Because we just can't do that. We don't do work from home. I was like, okay, that's interesting, because you have someone on the team, someone else on your team who works from home a couple of days a month for a medical reason. Do you want to talk to me about why that might be different? And that individual had an accident or something, and they got injections in their back to help them, steroid injections, once a month. So again, it was an interesting that it was it was the same sort of cycle. They had them once a month and it would affect them quite badly. It was quite intense. So for anywhere between 1 to 3 days each month after these injections, they would work from home because they really struggled physically, and it would make them quite tired as well. And then they would feel on top of the world, and then it would slowly sort of taper off, and then they'd get an injection, and they did this month on month. And they were probably the best performer on the team, right? And so they were sort of left to it. It was all fine. It's like, why are you okay to trust them because it's a back issue and they've got a consultant's letter, and you won't give the same allowances to this individual who's trying to figure out a new diagnosis just because it's, quote, women's problems? And he was like, okay, well, if she gets a consultant's letter, then maybe we'll do it. And I spoke to the individual and she said, oh no, I don't have a consultant. I just, it's my GP and a couple of tests we're doing, and we're trying to figure it out because there just isn't much provision in my area to get this figured out. And that, again, is the case of if women's health isn't given the attention that it needs in the healthcare system and the credibility that it deserves in the healthcare system.
100%.
How the hell are we supposed to do that in the workplace? That translates into the workplace then, where it's seen as something that we just need to get on with. And that's management.
That the gender pain gap is real. But I think you really nailed it, like with the curiosity thing. Like I'm such an advocate for like curiosity in any context, within our relationships, whether they're at work, with colleagues, team members, within our personal life. I don't think we can have enough curiosity, because I think with that comes understanding. You obviously have to put your active listening skills in place after that. But I think, people don't all want the same thing. And I think without leaning into that curiosity and thinking, oh, if someone has period pains, they want the whole day off, or they're taking the whole day off, maybe that's just because there's not another option. Some people feel like if they could work from home, then that would give them a little bit more flexibility and they could sort of deal with whatever they're going through with dignity, essentially. It's not too much to ask, but they don't feel like they need the whole day off. It doesn't wouldn't write off a whole day. Other people might feel like I've had a client, she's struggled massively with her fibroids, and she definitely needed that first day off most of the time because she was in like A&E with pain. So there's like varying degrees, but you don't know that if you're not having that conversation. And I do see why people might say like, oh, I've got a cold, or use whatever other excuse, especially if the culture's unsure, or if the manager's like not in a place to like have that curiosity, have that openness and conversation. Because it's that fear of being penalized, the fear of like missing out on opportunities, promotions, conversations, things that they might otherwise be like part of if they were present, but might be maybe excluded if they're seen as being flaky for missing out on their period.
Yeah, I've seen that happen in a recruitment setting where between, and this was really early in my career as well, and I think that's interesting that, again, talking about managers gaining confidence and growing over time, that happens to the individuals supporting them as well. There's things that I would feel confident challenging now and saying and doing now and advising now that I wouldn't have known to do 15, 20 years ago. And I remember being in a recruitment setting where we couldn't decide between two internal individuals, both brilliant, but for very different reasons. You know, where sort of one person's great at half the job and the other person's great at the other half, and it was like, oh, they could both do it. And genuinely, their line manager was on the panel, and she piped up and said, well, we should probably give it to that person, because she noted that the other person takes a day or two off a month for women's problems, was what she called it. So she's probably not going to be able to handle more responsibility anyway. And I remember thinking, oh my God, and they were with two older, more senior male managers who were just uncomfortable that she'd mentioned women's problems. I mean, like I said, this was sort of 15, 20 years ago. And the only thing that I could think to challenge in a way that wasn't going to get me kind of shouted at was, okay, but does that affect her current job? Because all the things you've been saying so far is that she's brilliant at her job, so I don't understand where this is coming from. And she was like, oh yeah, she's absolutely brilliant. And she'd probably be fine at this job, but, you know, if we have to make a decision, then that's probably the only thing that swings it for me. Because and interestingly, both candidates were of a similar age and female, and one of the gentlemen in the room kind of gently suggested, well, couldn't that also happen to the other lady? I don't understand why. And she was like, well, I get on with it every month.
Well done, that chap.
He was, and, you know, he was really like, I don't understand. He was, you know, quite rightly like, why is this even coming up? And we shouldn't be talking about someone's sick record in this context anyway, which was pointed out. But I felt that even though we shut it down and everyone agreed we weren't going to use that, the other person did end up getting the job. And I walked away from that feeling really grubby and really like, I can't shake the feeling that that clouded their judgment. And you just think, well, that's somebody's career, even though they went on to do brilliant things. That was a real opportunity for them that they probably didn't get because they were honest about why they were having time off. And you just think, that's why people lie. That's why people say they've got a cold, right? Or they've twisted their ankle or whatever it might be.
But actually, you know, and I know how much HR love data. Like, I'm a bit of a data nerd myself. I love doing my research projects. But I think it's important, you know, one of the reasons that it's not seen as a significant issue is because there is no data surrounding it, because in terms of absences, it's listed as, you know, a cold or something else. It's not put down to like menstrual issues. And so there's no real like idea in most organizations that there is need for accommodations, whether it's working from home, whether it's flexible working, whether it's just access to work in a quiet space, like go and work in a meeting room for a day or whatever it is, just to make somebody's experience just a little bit lighter, a bit easier, a bit more allow them to be more able to function, to do the things that they need to do, or to extend like time off if it is that, you know, you're not getting anything out of a person by making them sit at their desk and going through the motions. That's called presenteeism. and it's significant.
Nobody wins in that circumstance. And I think, again, it comes back to probably where there isn't a huge amount of understanding of menstruation and the cycle and all of that stuff, because people, you know, you go through your standard education classes in school and then that's it, because it's taboo and we don't speak about it, or it certainly used to be. So a lot of people that are in those positions of power at the moment are of our generation or above, where you didn't talk about it and you did sort of keep it to yourself. And boys would go through their lesson where they go, well, this is what happens to girls, and then they'd be absolutely clueless unless they happen to live with a particularly open mum or sister or whatever. You know, it's kind of luck of the draw then, isn't it? And then that translates into the workplace where they don't understand it. They are fearful of asking questions, which again is another issue. I don't blame people for not being curious sometimes, where they think they're going to cause offence, which is silly really. But they, you know, it's the environment that workplace has built. They don't ask the right questions. They don't seek to understand the issues in the same way that they would if it was any other physical ailment or even mental health. I don't know about you, but I find now that because the stigma on mental health was maybe starting to break, not that we're anywhere near good on that, but we're starting to break down. I feel like people are happier to ask people questions about their depression than they are about their menstruation cycle. You know, you see managers where they're going, okay, so you've been signed off for depression. Can I ask what's causing that? Is it a work-related thing? What can we do? How can we alleviate the pressure? How can we do this, this, and this? Do we think this is something that we'll need to deal with in time? All of those questions. Menstruation, they're not going to say, is this something that you're dealing with? Is it an acute problem? Is it something that you've dealt with your whole life? Where are we at with this? What can I do? What matters most to you? Is it that you need a private space, like you say? Because again, that's part of it. Sometimes people can do every aspect of their job. They just don't want to talk to anyone else that day, because they're either someone, you know, if you deal with like really extreme PMT or PDD is another one, isn't it? And
PMDD or neurodivergence.
100%, if you're dealing with that and you're going to struggle, or you're just in a lot of pain, and you can deal with your job because you can just find ways to get around that, and you're not pushing yourself too far. You're like, no, I can deal with it, and it's better. You know, some people like the distraction of a job, right? So I would never say that people needed to be off necessarily, but they don't want to deal with people walking past them and going, hey, how are you? Or like, did you see this last night? Or how was your weekend? Or all of that stuff, all of that lovely stuff that you get in the office. Yeah. Just like, oh God, I can't, I haven't got it in me to do that right now, which again could be for a range of other reasons. Why are we not having those conversations when it's to do with menstruation? It's just barking, isn't it? Because we could be missing out on so much magic from brilliant people. I just find it insane. There are so many people that have kept themselves small because of stuff related to the menstrual cycle. It's just tragic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Well, I am aware of our time.
Yeah.
I feel like I have
really
so much more to say. Feel like we just scratched the surface. Yeah, because I was going to keep these shorter because I know that people like don't have a whole bunch of time, but I just think it's so important to sort of like raise this awareness of like it doesn't have to cost money. It doesn't need to be revolutionary. You don't need like a whole thing. It can just be like if you're a manager, just taking a moment to just lean into curiosity and to not make assumptions, just in the same way that you would, like you're saying, like with mental health. And there are plenty of reasons why chronic menstrual conditions, PCOS, endometriosis, fibroids, etc., so many other different things can cause really, difficulties with mental health as well, because you struggle, you suffer. It can be, can cause like bouts of depression to constantly deal with illness or disorders or chronic fatigue, whatever it is. There's so much that can be achieved just by having a conversation, which is why my strapline is changing the conversation around being in a body that bleeds. But it's so true, and it's simple, and it's free, and it could start like today, like
I know,
the next conversation you have.
Curious, and any information that you gain, just to pull that into your toolkit as a manager or as a HR professional. I think it always comes back to being happy to say that you don't know things, and you will never know 100% of what's going on in a situation, because you're not that individual. You're not the individual that you're supporting. So you might have a lot of knowledge about menstruation and how it can affect people, but you still need to be curious, because it's not a one size fits all. And once you understand it, it's in your toolkit for dealing with that person, and potentially that's experience you can take on to the next person as well, and it all helps. It's just about knowing that it's not a weird thing that sits on the side of everything else. Just pull it in and deal with it as a health condition as you would do anything else.
Yeah. Amazing. So I wrap up these sessions with just one final question that I always think is very interesting, which is, do you, like, personally see either menstrual health generally or your menstrual health specifically like differently to how you did, like, especially as a child, like, or growing up in the 90s? Like, has it changed? Well, you're here, you're having a different conversation, but what's changed it for you?
I definitely do see it differently. And I think, I like to try and evolve over time anyway, like most people do. I think I'm probably more heightened by my work in HR and as a coach, and just being somebody that likes to kind of lift the lid on people's brains and be like, why do we do what we do? So I get that I'm coming from a position as somebody who is just naturally curious about how people work and how they think anyway. But I think that, having experienced growing up at that time where you just had to get on with it kind of alone, and then that following through into the workplace for me, that had a big impact on how I then was able. I felt I was limited in my role then, so I felt like I had to break out of that a little bit. But actually, as a parent of a daughter now as well, who's too young for this stuff now, but there'll come a time where this is a big part of our lives together. I'm really conscious of how I want things to be different for her, but there are also some things that I will probably pull through from what I experienced positively. And I think you just consider how menstruation stays with us throughout the different stages of our lives, because when you're younger, even as a teenager, you're kind of bringing some adult themes to literal children, and that's the weird sort of thing about menstruation, isn't it? Is that it's so, you can have children and you look at all the biological side of it and you're talking to children about it who that doesn't even enter their head, right? So it's always going to be a strange subject to be bringing up to younger kids. But if you do it in a way that's healthy and that's on their level, I mean, think of how much better off those kids now that are sort of like 10 years old going into being teenagers, how much more clearer on things and happier to talk about things they'll be when they get to the world of work, if we can have those positive conversations about things now. So it definitely changed things for me in being a parent and able to reflect back on why I might be thinking about things in a certain way. But definitely it's virtue of being in HR and being privy to a lot of information that most other people who work in corporate roles aren't. You just have the good conversations with people.
Interesting. I love it. I love seeing how people's stories have shaped over time. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Amy, for coming on to chat to me. It's been really fun. And and thank you everybody for listening. I was trying to keep an eye on the chat this week, which I was doing. I don't know. I'll always get back to that later. I get too engrossed in listening.
And people will listen to this on catch up as well and stuff. So yeah, you can always message us with any questions. But it's been lovely to talk through. It's such an amazing series that you're doing, and it's I hope it opens up more and more conversations.
Yeah. Oh, and the last thing, how would you like people to be able to reach out to you? Where can they find you? Is there anything particularly you want anyone to know, everyone to know?
They can find me on LinkedIn is probably the best place, and all of my information is on there, as my information about Magpie People, my business that I'm running at the moment. So yeah, you can find me there. Feel free to slide into the old DMs and have a conversation about all things management, team dynamics, people, culture, all of that jazz.
Amazing. Okay. See you next time, everyone. Bye. Thanks, Amy.